To introduce today's speaker, I'm going to bring up someone who to this audience really needs no introduction. Gordon Bell is in many ways responsible for this institution. He and his wife Gwen started it along with some other people at Digital Equipment Corporation back in the late 1970s in Boston. And it is because of him and his encouragement that we moved it successfully out to the West Coast. We purchased this building and are on our way to building a premier institute to preserve the history of computing. So please join me in welcoming Gordon Bell.
Thank you. It's a great honor to perform this introduction. I've known Suhas, I think, for probably 30 years now. My system that's supposed to record everything couldn't find the first date, memo when we had first met. But I'll start with what's written down that I didn't necessarily know, and that was that Suhas got his bachelor's degree at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur in 1965, and then ended up getting his PhD at MIT in 1970. There he served during that period of the formation of Project Mac, was the assistant director of Project Mac, which was working on the time-sharing system that MIT had been working on. He was fortunate enough to leave MIT and ended up going to becoming a professor at the University of Utah during 75 and 80. Now, my first connection with Suhas, I think on a detailed technical level, was in 78 or so when he came to digital to talk about structured logic arrays, which was a way of doing logic design in a very generalized and structured in very, very clean fashion. And so I'll say that his bio has been you can read about that. I won't say that, but I'd like to say that in fact there's sort of two characteristics. If you ask me about Suhas, how I think of him is one that I hope I share a little bit, and that's the idea of elegance and generality. And the issue of structured logic array was to go after the design of chips in a very structured and repeatable fashion in a high methodology thing, which is, I'd say, in contrast to what most of the chips that are designed in today's world and for the last 30 since the integrated circuit, I'll say since the integrated circuit, they're just not very elegant. And Suhas has really tried to put that in a very generalized and structured form, which he did with SLA. And then for the last 7 years, has been involved with a company called Cradle Technology, which I hope he'll say a little bit about too, which is, again, the generalization, trying to make a computer do what chips were done so that you can do in software what would normally be done by thousands of engineers with their teeth trying to build chips the way we do today. So he's really taken two whacks at the design problem that I think are meritorious and separates him from virtually everybody who does chip design. And then the other, and that I'll say that last 7 years separates him in another dimension, which I don't share, and that's the issue of long-term persistence. Cradle has taken 7 years to get those chips. As a board member, it's certainly been we keep hoping that they will appear, and finally they have appeared, and they are in a product now. But it was really solely to Suhas's persistence that the company exists today. The other thing is that in this idea of persistence is you can tell by the institutions he's involved with how he feels about that, and which is the founder of the Indus entrepreneurs and starting that as something, believing in a long-term institution. And then in that same spirit, we've been delighted to have, I'm delighted that Suhas is a member of the Board of Trustees because he believes in this long-term preservation thing. So that has to do with this long-term aspect that I think of in Suhas. So anyway, Suhas has got to tell his story.
Well, Gordon, thank you very much for not just kind introduction, but introduction. I have had Gordon as my, mentor. I've looked up to him and almost went to work with him in Carnegie Mellon, and I don't know why I didn't go there. MIT, I stayed at MIT, but I wish I had. But I have been working with him. So it gives me great pleasure, to share the story behind stories. And of course, this is a technology transition story, of my journey from the very early days, and hopefully I will be able to share with you what you find interesting. So let's start from the beginning. My father is another interesting fellow. He was the first person from his village to go to engineering college, where there wasn't even a high school in his village. And then he got mechanical as well as electrical engineering from Banaras Hindu University, which at that time was like MIT in India. And if that wasn't enough, he went to work for Tata Iron and Steel Company as a metallurgist in the metallurgical lab. And if that wasn't enough, to support his brother and sister through college, he started a radio repair shop, and then finally ended up in cost accounting department and ended up as CFO of this large company. So you can see that his background is very, very diverse, and definitely it influenced me in a great deal. The benefit of doing the radio repairs was that all the tools were at home, and I had general access to it. So I started playing with them, and you will see that in some of the things I did. So I want to present to you the first project that I did that I thought was of any significance. What you see is a project I did for the science contest, which used to be held in my town. Now, I had seen this, 2,000 leagues under the sea, was enamored by it, and set about to build a submarine just the way submarines work. Battery, motor, all the sophisticated, electrical stuff. Since I had access to no motor, I tried to build one. And this was my summer project. I kept working on it until 1 week before, when I admitted to myself finally that the project was doomed and whatever I was trying would never be completed. So it's like startup companies, back to drawing board. And I said, no, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to display the principles that I employed in submarine as operation. So I cobbled up a submarine using entirely different principles. And what you see is that those two little containers are those aluminum Kodak containers for the 35mm film. The nose is salt shaker. There's a nail in it. The two round balls, one is a tennis ball, but rubber, which can pump air in, the other one to pump water in. And this contraption actually could go up, go down, and propel itself. And so it's interesting that I finally learned that you have to keep your head cool, even as the deadline is approaching, and it has helped me ever since, and I seem to need it every time. Now, I began my participation with computers really with electronics, and it happened the following way. Since there were all these components at home, I also discovered a handbook of the amateurs. It was called ARRL handbook, which is the amateur's handbook. And from that, I learned how to build a transmitter and played with it, and it was all wonderful. And that became my basis for deciding to study electronics as opposed to mechanical engineering, which was the most commonly sought after field when I was a young boy. My first exposure to computers came at IIT Kharagpur, where a 1620 was donated to the IIT by IBM. That's the first taste I got of writing a Fortran program, and really I found it so logical and so easy to do, and therefore it became my basis for wanting to go to graduate school and specialize in computers. So this is a picture I took in the computer room at IIT in 1964. I was very lucky to get admission in MIT together with a teaching assistantship, because otherwise I just couldn't afford to go there. But the assistantship was in the circuits group and communications things. So I had been looking to somehow find a way to get involved with the computer things. And I landed a summer job, which is very interesting. Just a few years before, 1966, a time-sharing system had been developed at MIT called the Compatible Time-Sharing System, CTSS. It was built by a team headed by Corbato, and it ran on a computer, IBM Computer 7094. This was the first remote access or time-sharing system that existed, and the department had a problem of keeping current all the assignments of the professors, as well as accounting for them in the correct budget categories and charge them against the sponsored research. And since there were 100 professors, almost 100 TAs, and another 100 research assistants, this used to be constantly in state of flux, and they just couldn't get it ever a stable state if they would type it. So they said, well, can you build a system? So I landed a summer job. Okay. Now, interesting, these were early days, and I would like to share with you what was the technology at that time and how I actually did. The language I used was MAD, M-A-D, which people haven't heard, and F-A-P, which is assembly language. And since I had not really fully studied computer science, I had to be very inventive, and I said, I don't have enough time, therefore I must leverage somebody else's work. So the system called for inputting in text using teletype and creating a database, do the sorting, create a report, and output will be again either online access or through the teletype. Now the formatting into very pleasant things was a very complex job, and I found that Jerry Salzer, who had done his PhD at MIT, actually had written a program called Runoff. And so I made sure I would produce output which normally would be produced by human beings, for this program, so they would take it and then output a real formatted thing. There were more than a dozen modules, and I had designed all modules together with the environment to test it. The reason I say it, because 1 week after this summer was over, I had to give my qualifying examination, and I couldn't afford to get the calls from the department. As it turned out, that methodology worked extremely well, and the system, when it was put together, and I don't exactly remember how many modules, but there may have been as many as 17 modules, in the system. It just came up, and online stuff wasn't there before, so I was very afraid that something might be wrong, would be hard to debug, and it just came and ran, and in peace, I was able to give my qualifying examination. So that was my first real, big project, and I don't know if anybody else built a online management system before 1966, and if nobody did, then I would have been the very first person to build an online system. It just happened to be in the right place, very lucky, the right time, and be given this particular job. So with this thing, I would manage to get into computer science. So, what do you do in computer science? Those days, in the 60s, there was a hope on part of computer scientists that since they had met with several success of how to characterize computer science, that it was indeed a science as opposed to engineering, and that there was a hope that you could systematize it so well that, like the electrical engineers had their Maxwell's equations, everything could be derived from it. It turns out that that's not the case, and computer science is a very unique and interesting, science. But in that vein, I had been, doing things. So this is the first paper I wrote, which was in 1966, which says, parallelism is going to be important because that's how you get higher performance. So how do you do the languages in order to do parallel processing? And lambda expressions are very esoteric, as far as programmers is concerned. But there was a hope that that's by several people that it might, in fact, be how you write computer programs. So I figured out the parallel execution of it, which was a surprise to people. And so it allowed me to write a paper and get an A in the class. So with that sort of getting closer to mathematics, it turned out my doctoral work pretty soon became almost applied mathematics. And my doctoral thesis was coordination of asynchronous events. Now, interestingly, out of that came a theorem after my thesis, which I still believe today, the finest work I did, and this thing will remain so for a long, long time, because we had a concern that when you do self-time systems, that they might behave non-deterministically. That means they may not repeat the performance consistently. So the question was, what are the properties of it? What I found out that if you start with components which are deterministic and you build a larger system using just those components, then whatever you build will be deterministic. So this is once you finally understand it. It is very simple. But what it does allow you to do, if something isn't working right, it's coming from a single or specific modules which themselves are not deterministic. So you can see I was just getting into more and more math. Okay, it's time to get back to reality. So my group at MIT, was working on ways of building self-timed, systems. So a lot of work got done, and this is really where, in the beginning of 70s, the chips were becoming bigger and becoming such that it became very clear to me that any methodology that is worked out, unless it matched very well with silicon, it could not have an impact. So that is when I started transforming all the work I had into a implementation which could be done on a surface, which is what a semiconductor chip is. It's all, the circuit is done on surface. And that's really the whole notion of storage logic array came. Now you can see up above I have the more conventional things I was doing, and down below, okay, is the more systematic structure. And on the right-hand side, you see Petri net, which was used as the method of describing what kind of control you wanted, and what I had arranged that anything you call for in Petri net form, you could implement just by systematically putting those 0, 1s, and crosses on that matrix. And that became the basis of storage logic array. And this is like a circuit representation of it. So out of all of these things, I evolved a method of designing chips. At that time, the chips were getting bigger. Transistors were coming left and right. And Gordon Moore said every 18 months you'll have twice as many transistors. And one could see very clearly that there would be 100,000 transistors available. And people were dreading how to go do designs of chips with so very many transistors, because at that time designs were done by designing every transistors. And in fact, there were no CAD tools even to draw the transistors. You had to do that on Ruby lit. Okay, those were the days. Okay? So I said, all right, find methodology. Now, the methodology was simple enough that I actually could specify or design a chip on a graph paper. And that's what is a picture of. Literally, a graph paper, writing 0s and 1s and symbols on it in a symbolic way. I specified what this particular chip was to do. Okay. Now, I built a compiler, or my team built a compiler, which then translated that into a composite. So in the sense of the word compilation, it really was compilation, even though one could argue perhaps that it really is a form of assembling, because it didn't do some of the very sophisticated things compilers could do. But in the world of chips, at least it allowed one to control faithfully the characteristics of the chip. Now, this particular chip replaced a board, and it's done very quickly. It became the basis for the funding. Now, to relate to you what was going on at that time, Carver Mead had come with this, again, idea of, hey, computer scientists need to learn how to do chips, and he had the sticks approach to it, as well as, he, sort of persuaded several people to work on silicon compiler. So there were really 3 different lines of attack on this problem. One was the storage logic arrays, what I was doing. Another one was really, start from, lower structures and write programs to go build, things, which was then called silicon compilers. And then there was a standard cell, okay? And many people didn't think standard cell as silicon compiler, but in fact that is what it was. And the routers were not very efficient in the 70s, but the algorithms started getting better, and CMOS came to help, because prior to that you had one layer of metal and polysilicon layer, and polysilicon was a lousy conductor. And so you had to be very careful in designing the chip. So once the 2 layers of metal came, and the algorithms improved, the standard cell could be, laid and routed consistent with any netlist you gave. And there was a need for a language. In the beginnings of the 80s, DARPA, was sort of pushing a language called VHDL. And Dr. Prabhu Goyal, who is in audience here, he came up with Verilog, which was a lot simpler, that engineers could adopt. I think that Verilog, together with the synthesis, which Synopsys, came up with, and then place and route, much of that work was being done in Berkeley, all that combined to a very effective methodology, which really became far more widespread than any other methodology. And that is really how silicon compilers came. Now, I had been working with this far more structured way, and at that time, I really had a practical silicon compiler in the 1980. And I tried to get people to adopt it, and the traction I got was with General Instrument Corporation. And they said, well, this sounds good. We can build system on a chip. The definition of system on a chip keeps moving, okay? So at that time, whatever the system they perceived they wanted to do on a chip, so they gave a funding for me to go do this thing for the real. And that's really when I quit my teaching job and set about to build a real system to implement the methodology. Now, what you see here, the slides, they are from the system we built, in the company I started, which really started at the research park of University of Utah, because I had gone there, to do the storage logic array work. And at that time, the company was called Patil Systems, and in fact, Ravindra, who is in the audience, had just finished his doctorate, from the department, and he joined me, and the engineers in General Instrument thought this bunch of guys who never designed chips, how can they, design chips? And so we had to convince the senior VP that, we were okay after all, and you will see some of the chips done. And so starting from RTL description, we would go straight, to rewriting that RTL in this stylized form. This is now, with aid of design automation, what otherwise I was doing on piece of paper, okay? And once it was put in this form, we could extract from it netlist and feed it into a simulator and simulate it extremely well. And once satisfied, we could, really literally, compile it into the chip. Now, to give you some idea, this is, again, I was back into doing software, million lines of code, and the simulator we built actually, I believe was one of the very best, available at that time. We had accuracy with timing of about 5% for local circuits and 10% from long circuits, which was unheard of when we would do whole chip simulation. And this is in the early 80s. Once we had this composite, we could just create the mask, and what you see is a photograph of the actual chip produced. So this chip really was the first commercial high volume chip. The first one I showed you, only 20,000 were made, of this chip, and its subsequent versions, 6 million units were made. A huge argument was raging, in the beginning of the 80s. They felt that this method that I had, which was so nice in terms of writing zeros and ones to go do things, perhaps was only good for prototyping. And I tried to convince people it wasn't so, but not to much avail. Okay, so we just said, all right, we'll just use it. By the way, I had, when General Instrument funded me, they also agreed to sell me wafers at fixed price, and they were not normal fab for other people, but I had that relationship. So, you see all the early chips were all processed by General Instrument Corporation. And about this time, we decided that Utah was really not a place where the market was or the VCs were. So we ended up coming to Silicon Valley, and that's really when I met with Mike Hackworth, who had been actually tracking my technology. And so with the help of the VCs, we met. And when I see a good man, I don't let him go. So Mike really became a mentor, and pretty soon, joined forces with me, and that was really the turning point in going boldly to go build what is today Cirrus Logic. So that is how we created a business model. The model at that time was previous to Mike and I getting together, that if you wanted to be a semiconductor company, you had to build a fab. And we said, well, fab doesn't do much good if you don't have a design. And we said we will focus on the design, and it is the design technology that will allow us to go process our chips at any of the fabs we wanted. Besides that, the designers now didn't have to be transistor designers, they could be system logic designers. So this is really another interesting aspect of things where when people look at optimization, the optimizations can be done at very many levels. And what people were telling us that if you can't build high volume circuitry or high volume chips unless you tweaked every transistor. And we were really coming from computer science background. We said, no. There's many different places where to optimize. So it turns out that indeed the logic designers could do a better design as well as produce chips that yielded better. Therefore, people were surprised when the first major chip of Cirrus Logic really was set-top converter. The second one was in disk drives. And anybody who knows these businesses, they are tough businesses, and only very high volume, highly efficient chips can serve them. So interestingly enough, that model that we finally had figured out then became industry standard practice, and has been that way for last almost 20 years. So mid-90s, I started again seeing that now the transistors are going to become 1 million transistors to 100 million transistors, and it was getting harder and harder to do the design. Even known good teams were having a difficult time. So I said, maybe time for a change. And I gave a talk, actually at the invitation, of Gordon on functional parallelism. And that was the beginning of this idea that perhaps technology had come sufficiently far that we could, in fact, think about doing the function of a chip entirely in software, if you actually did a good architecture and the software system to go with it. Now, at that time, it looked like such a difficult task, and many people called me crazy, as they had called me crazy when I was doing Cirrus Logic. So the whole idea was, you architect the chip in such a manner that you can exploit parallelism, for which you must do proper mix between DSP, RISC engine, memory control, memory, as well as be able to do programmable logic. Now, that architecture, was studied and evolved in Cirrus Logic, and then Cradle got spun off as a company. An interesting comparison of this thing to how the communications people think. They have 7 layers. In this case, you have a layer which is near the pins, so you want to make pins programmable. Behind that, you have programmable logic because you want to, answer or respond very quickly. And beyond that, you have protocol engines, and beyond that, you have RISC engine and then DSP engines. Now, it turns out that this was sort of a technical assessment, which wasn't so very clear in the beginning, but I had persuaded myself that it would work in this manner. So it did take a long time, but we do have a chip that is based on this principle. And interestingly enough, this chip is able to do what otherwise you would do in a application-specific chip using designing of gates. To give you some examples of what can be done, normally PCI bus is designed in circuits. In this particular chip, it is a program. Very, very difficult compression algorithms, they sort of seem to kind of come out of woodworks. They are computationally very, very difficult. Well, so this chip actually, does encode, decode, and handles communication all at the same time. But the biggest, from a computational point of view, the issue is, can you scale the computation as you add processors? Normally, in a processor, beyond 4x performance increase using parallelism is hard to come by. Well, when you have architecture like this, and the problems require enormous amount of signal processing, it is possible to scale fairly linearly in the kind of numbers we are looking at. And on the right-hand side, you can see those actual results. And we have seen, you can scale to 8, 16, and no problem. And there are technical reasons why it can happen. So anyway, what does Cradle say? Okay. It says, look, instead of implementing every function as a unique circuit on a chip, move that, to function in software. Make that programmable. And thus, the methodology becomes similar to software methodology. So, instead of taking a chip and modularly breaking it down to different functioning parts, you make a uniform chip, and the non-uniformity is in the form of code, and it becomes a functional solution. Okay? In a way, what you have here is a multi-functioning, multi-processor, multi-DSP platform, and it is like a symphony. It does work with the software development system, and it is the beginning, of, I believe, how the semiconductor, desired semiconductor solutions are going to be prepared, because it is taking too much money today to go build each unique chip. It takes easily, $750,000 in mass costs, and those things I'm told is going to be more than $1 million. And it takes too large a team. Even design automation software you need in order to do is very large. So how can you deal with it? You deal with it in a programmable manner. So now this thing is a history in making. It hasn't happened yet. And certainly it is a technology transition if you say this actually happens. And it will allow one to actually lower the barrier to doing solutions. And those who know domains then can, in fact, bypass the act of actually doing unique chip in order to implement the solution. So that's how I used to look 20 years ago. Behind me is the SLA screen. So, in summarizing, actually I have been very lucky. I've been in the right place at the right time, and technology is, even in my short, almost 50 years, but short life, technology gone through so many transitions, and I think there's more to come. And but it's really, we live in a fascinating time. Okay? Now, my father lives with me. I was hoping he could come, but he's 90 years old, and today he said he couldn't come. But it would have been wonderful. My wife is here, and her dad, his background is no different from what my dad went through. He also did the electronics. He also did the photography. Must have been the time for the last generation. But both of us does, tremendously, gain from that. And Silicon Valley is absolutely a wonderful place, to go, do interesting things and take the risk. I think basically, the semiconductor, field, which has really impacted everything, it is going computational, okay? And I believe that to be very strongly so. And I am really betting my reputation on it. So computers, from being big boxes, became mini computers to, workstation to PC to now we have multiple processors in a single chip to do ordinary, but interesting tasks. Thank you very much.
You certainly have a remarkable career, and the one thing I'd like to know is, as you went through the progression of developing new chips, etc., you must have hit many obstacles as well as dead ends. What is the single strongest skill that you would claim is essential for an entrepreneur to succeed over the long haul, to be able to get over these insurmountable barriers and not give up? Is it the Cortez mentality of saying, well, we burnt our ships, we've got no other way to go? I mean, could you shed some light on that, please?
Okay. I think some of it is foolishness. Okay. All right. But what I have watched is that in order to survive, you need to be very sure wherever you get engaged, you do that after doing a whole lot of work so that you really are passionate about it. In each case, there was almost 5 to 7 years of work in my case involved before I came to a point where I said, even though it doesn't look so clear, but I feel it in my bone. So with that, then what you do, is you go at it, with full force. Now, there's a very thin line between foolishness, and great entrepreneurship. So that's a very, very difficult to judge. What I employed, my family has no business background whatsoever. So it was all new thing for me. I remember before I started, what became Cirrus Logic, I went to all my friends and mentors and actually would take down notes and gathered their thoughts and so on for almost 18 months before I said, I really want to do it. And so that gave me the strength to go do the work. The other thing is, the work begins a lot sooner where you start building relationship, you develop mentoring relationships, and it's never done by a single person at all. It really is a community effort, it is a team effort. To give you some examples, when I started, I knew so little about business. The first thing I discovered, the language of the financial world is totally different. And it was my professor at MIT, my American host family, then my classmate. I mean, all of these people, I would talk with them at least once a week, even after I started the company. And that played a huge role. To answer some of your questions, let me sort of share with you what happened in the chip that I showed you. We had a contract from General Instruments, so we were doing very well, and then the economy, like today's economy, went down and life became difficult. We hadn't quite finished our technology, okay? So now we went and got a job from General Instrument Corporation, which was the cable guys, big guys in cable. And this was 1983, okay? And I got NRA, plus I got a letter of intent, and I did the pricing negotiation, $4, and couldn't get a penny more. Okay, but $4 it was, but I said, all right, you need to tell me how many you're going to buy, okay? And no just round words. I want you to write it down, okay? Then I'll do it. And so they said 300,000 units, $4, $1.2 million. Remember, dollar in the early 80s was like 3x, today. So whatever it was worth, but at least it was a piece of paper. Okay. My problem was I designed the chip, okay, but had no money to manufacture it, okay? So I'm sitting here in Salt Lake City and, wondering what to do, okay? And finally I came to a conclusion. This thing was so new that nobody believed in it. The most important thing for me was for it to come into being so people can see that this stuff really works, okay? And so I actually literally gave away that design to the semiconductor division of General Instrument Corporation. And they didn't even pay me any royalties, but agreed that they will process it on their own nickel. And so Thanksgiving, I gave them the tape. Nothing was happening until December. So I said, this is going nowhere. We're about to move to California. I gotta get this thing processed. So I did a daring thing. I called up the CEO of this billion-dollar corporation, and I said, I have to see you, okay? I absolutely have to see you. Because of the strength of my conviction, he said, fine. I am passing through Phoenix. You see me in this American Airlines, whatever that Admirals Club. And so I did see him for, an hour. And I convinced him that he had to tell the semiconductor guys to process it, otherwise he would not know whether my stuff works or not. He said he will call a review, guess what? Before the review was to happen, the chip was in process, and in 21 days, the chip was processed. Unfortunately, as an entrepreneur, you have to sort of do things. Now, I gave my crown jewels to these guys, but what bet I made? 2. When I said that this thing would be to show that the stuff works. And the second one, the customer is always going to come back and want an improved version of it, in which case only we knew how to do. And that's exactly what happened. So when they asked, Mike was already with me, and that time we said, we're not sharing this thing with anybody. And we, in fact, sold, I think, almost 4 million units of that. And that is the first time we earned $1 million in a quarter. So it helped build the company. Sometimes you have to do this.
Good evening to you. I'm Kailash Gupta. Following from the earlier question, could you elaborate on this your help in developing other entrepreneurs, how you got into this and what motivated you into that?
Well, actually, AJ Patil is right here. AJ and a few of those people, including, early days, actually, I was talking with Prabhu. He said, we got to do something to give back to the community. And AJ was the one who finally came after me saying, okay, we'll just get together. And he constantly kept us, wanting to have dinner every month. But out of that came a realization that that we did want to give back, because we were already in mid-ages, and, we had succeeded and wanted to give back to Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. And after a long deliberation, we figured out we didn't know a whole lot about lots of things, but definitely knew how, to start companies and make them successful. We had learned through the School of Hard Knocks, and if we could pass that on to the next generation, we'd probably do more good than any other way. And based on that, the TIE actually grew, and I got drafted to be his founding president, and at which time I shaped, what TIE, became. And it's a very collective effort, and I had a sense that, the community here could benefit a great deal, as well as it would strongly engage. And that's exactly what happened, far beyond, what I had imagined.
Good evening. My name is Mangala Iyer, and it's my honor to be here today. My question is, in today's world, what's your advice for the first-time entrepreneurs who are just starting out?
First-time entrepreneurs. Well, there are lots of organizations, in the Valley, where the people who have succeeded and the ones who are aspiring come together, and you get to listen to them. And not just TIE, but other organizations, but TIE definitely is there. I think it is by listening, to these things that you actually start formulating, better and better idea of how, to, do it. It's not about starting. It's so easy to start a company. All you have to do is get a lawyer, and, boom, you have a company. What you have to really figure out is how to choose what to do, and after you have chosen, how to talk people into joining you so that you have a fighting chance of succeeding. I think that really, in my case, that learning occurred starting from, Professor Amar Bose started the Bose system, and he was the first person I heard, his story as to, how did they decide, what did they do, and then I took interest in listening to anybody who talked about this whole process. And over time, you learn. There's no magic about it. It's just a matter of learning.
Good evening. My name is Manoj. My question is about future of Valley as a physical place for leading edge of innovation. So with internet and availability of internet, the knowledge and innovation is not just limited to a physical place. Like a boy in a village in, say, India or China, he has same access to anybody else in the world. So with that in mind, with future, is it possible for Valley as a physical place to keep the leading edge? And if possible, what do you think the ways where Valley can still lead as a place of innovation? Thanks.
Well, this process has been going on. The future is not guaranteed for anybody, but in the Valley, all these disciplines are here, and more work is, good work will come out of interdisciplinary, work. And, the Valley has critical mass of people to be able to do the innovation. In the earlier times, the formation of capital also was present here. Now it is present elsewhere too. So we'll just have to work hard. And my personal belief is that because the creativity process hasn't ended, the need for creativity hasn't ended, I think we have a very good chance of sort of figuring out next wave. And that's the nature of Silicon Valley, and we're very well suited for it. It will happen by us wanting to do it, not just by some position we have acquired as a valley where automatically stuff comes to us. And I have to say that Silicon Valley people work very hard. Okay, if I have a choice of hiring someone from Silicon Valley or anywhere else, I always will pick a person from Silicon Valley. I mean, it's just, the spirit is just that strong, and there's a way of doing things. Now, should we not leverage the rest of the world? Absolutely. But we certainly have a pretty good future. Now, we have to shape it ourselves.
Dr. Patil, good evening. My name is Rakesh Sharma. I am also from Kharagpur. I share the same alma mater, and I'm honored to be here. I'm really not an electronics or a computer sciences major, but I had a question from you from your presentation. You mentioned something about the optimization, and I don't know if this is a correct understanding, but is there a way by which you optimize what goes into the software part and what stays in the circuit? Did you say something along those lines? Is that what Cradle is about?
The statement I made is, when things start becoming larger, as in number of transistors, you can optimize at the very lowest level of detail or the intermediate level or higher level. And so oftentimes people who are engaged in work and thoroughly understand that, they discount what can be done at a higher level, at a policy level, at the strategy level, at the structure of the entire system, how you go about solving the problem in the first place. Okay? My very first project I showed you, okay, I'd failed in the first attempt, but succeeded in the second. So it does tell you that it does make a huge difference, how you solve problem at the highest level. So optimization isn't, achieved only at one level. Now, once you make, soft silicon work, the optimization, problem gets divided. The chip guy does optimization of the silicon, and the application person does the optimization of the algorithms and the software. So that's, I hope. Now, nobody asked me a question. If I had to sort of start all over again, what might I study? Okay. Interesting. Okay. In 1970, I thought maybe time to get into biotech, except I knew nothing about it. Okay. In 1980, before starting computing, I said, this is a very interesting stuff. And I did take some courses. I said, gosh, there is so much to it. That's a field, I think, where tremendous amount of innovative stuff is going to get done in the next 50 years. And, I'd watch that very carefully. It's coming, it's slow, but it is how electronics was when I got into it. So if I were going to college today, I might consider biotech.
Second question here.
I'm Kailash Gupta again. This is second question. You said you started with the ARRL handbook, so amateur radio. First part is whether you are continuing your hobby, whether you got an amateur radio license. Number two, I'm a ham, and I was in Baroda when the Gujarat earthquake occurred, and I was part of the first team which went to the Gandhinagar, and we started re-establish the communication. In Gujarat earthquake, you will know about 20,000 people died. And I am an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad. And seeing the disaster, how it was managed, I deeply became interested in disaster management. And afterwards, I had done a lot of research and presented papers. And now I applied for doctoral program in disaster management in 6 universities here. So I saw your website, some of the guidance you have given, some of the interview of the PhD, how it is good and what it brings. So at my stage, I want to know what advice you will give for doing PhD.
Well, firstly, I never earned the, ham operator's license. It required you to be very proficient in Morse code, which I never really, well, when I was a youngster, that's what it required. And I never mastered that well enough to appear for the exam. And you had to see, I was really a technologist, not so much a ham operator. So the book happened to be there, and it forced me to learn English, okay, to read it and understand it. And so it played a very important role for me. About more specific advice, you just give me a call. I mean, it's not a simple answer, but give me a call. And by the way, I did find some of those chips that I talked about that I'm going to, leave behind here. I had to go into an attic and search for them, but I did manage to find them. And I have preserved all the design documentation for all the chips, that were presented here. And, we can approach Cirrus Logic to actually transfer them, the whole folders. They still exist. And I have preserved somewhere in office a copy of the Stride system on tape. If the tape hasn't gone bad, then you would have the source code of it available.
Hi, this is Manoj again. As a successful entrepreneur and part of the TIE, I assume a lot of people approach you for, as an entrepreneur, they want to have your help or something. So apart from, specific areas which they want to start a company, what other characteristics you look into an entrepreneur or a proposal? Are there any general characteristics, which is kind of makes you feel good or bad, or is there any kind of advice which are qualities for that? Thanks.
Well, it's a very, the answer would be very long, but first thing is you need to be intellectually honest, and that's a very important. So that helps you, not be foolish, because this involves risk taking, and then also that is necessary in order to persuade other people to join, and know when things are not working properly. So that's one of the first important things. And then it turns out that, wherever you are going to go build a business, I mean, how much prepared you are, yourself as well as the team. And watch out, there's lots of good ideas, good, useful things can be done. Only some things make business sense, because somebody must pay for whatever, you have to offer. And those are some few thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah, my name is Ranjan Desai, and I just wanted to have your opinion about the buzz things that are going on in the media about the job losses to India other things. So is it going to help the economy here, in your opinion, or is it detrimental to the
well, I
US?
tell you, interesting. I mean, this is what is happening in India as well as China. It's very important for a company, to survive. Otherwise, it can't create no jobs whatsoever. And given the financing environment that has prevailed here for the last 2 years, it has been necessary for small companies to go leverage, India and other places, even to be around. Okay. So for small companies, I actually can tell you absolutely, they will create jobs here as long as they survive, and then when the economy becomes better, they grow. The interesting perspective is, supposing you decide that no jobs will go to India and there will be no participation. Okay? See, knowledge isn't, monopoly of any one set of people. Okay? You could have a situation where, while India and China never produce software products, if they produce software products, okay, they could afford to sell it for much less. So you have a choice. Either you adjust your cost structure by being part of the globe, or be very, close-minded. Okay. In the end, what has to work is, overall, we must create jobs here, otherwise the system will fail. By the way, India is not as cheap as you think, because the productivity of Silicon Valley guys is pretty high. So, yes, BPO processing there maybe, but talk about sophisticated software writing. I think we don't count Silicon Valley out at all.
Pratipal Singh. Glad to hear there's somebody else who wants to be a biotech. As you know, I'm a chemist, and my knowledge on computers from the scale of 1 to 10 is -1. So, starting with that one, I think on a chip, mostly the electrons move from one place to another place. If I compare in the chemical reactions, electrons move from one place to another place. There's a lot of similarity. And important part in the solution chemistry is that you can miniaturize to the extreme. So the question I have is, from your vision, how long will it take, if it ever, that people will see computers in a solution rather than on a solid surface?
Yeah, that's interesting. People have been sort of talking about things. I am not aware of any discoveries that have been made, to effectively build a computer, general purpose computer from biological things. But we know that it has been done, namely, our brain. So I think our understanding just is not mature enough, and at some point, so there will be enough understanding, to, sort of have a basis for actually building something. And let me trace the last century was pretty interesting. In the beginning of the century, people didn't even know the structure of atom. Okay, they didn't know that there was nucleus, there was electrons. There was very, sort of only macro understanding of things. That happened. The physics developed, understanding of materials developed. People were observing different effects, and that's how the transistor came. Prior to that, of course, the vacuum tube were there, but vacuum tube, because they consumed a lot of power, you had limitation on how big a thing you could build. It took almost 50 years after the discovery or understanding of atoms, structure of atom before useful things came. Now the double helix, was discovered in the, I believe, 50s, okay, or thereabouts. So I think it's about time somebody found some effects that could be used. But we shouldn't talk just in terms of building computers. I mean, what you might do with that might be, quite different. For example, the chemical factories of tomorrow could be entirely different than how they're built today. I think it's a very rich and very complex, subject. The field of biology, far more complex than electronics, and I think therefore it takes a longer time. It will happen. I don't know when.
I have one question myself, actually, that was triggered by some remarks you made earlier on about the relationship between science and engineering. It sometimes seems to me that computer engineering benefits much less than many other engineering fields, like civil engineering and aeronautical engineering, in a basis of scientific principles to help us do the construction of the systems we build. Do you think there is a body of scientific principles yet undiscovered which will help us in the future to systematize some of those processes?
It's a very, very interesting question. What I, as I learned computer science, and started working, what I realized, unlike some fields where very few principles and equations sort of unfold to, sort of manifest the entire science. Computer science, is made up of, extremely large number of concepts, and each concept itself is very solid and, forms the total body of knowledge that is necessary. That means its dimensionality is way beyond other sciences. So so any hope of Turing's theorem, I mean, it is fundamental, but doesn't help you actually build a computer. And the business of building computer can be viewed like this. Supposing you inherited 1 million transistors, okay, and all the components you ever wanted or wish to have, how are you going to put them to use? That is really what the whole job of architect is, how to organize them. So it has to do with not study of nature as much as, principles, of, creating functioning organizations. And it's amazing, the nuggets of, useful pieces of information, if you just start counting, they're just, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Okay? And you have to read Professor Knuth's book, it has so very many algorithms, and you soon realize that not until you have a working set of knowledge of them can you become very effective. So I have no hope of simple principles that take care of all computer science. It's a body of principles, and they can be thus taught, all of them.
So I guess it will continue to take hard work is the answer. Thank you very much for a wonderful evening. You clearly are an inspiration to many people.